Today, I'm going to continue talking about the rise of the British Empire. Predominantly, I'm going to kind of focus more on the Stuart dynasty, the rest of that, and I'll get to the House of Hanover. I will talk about the House of Windsor, mostly talk about some of the later rulers they have, because I'm really not going to focus on the actual imperial part of the empire, which kind of takes off in the 1800s, but I'll do that more when I get to the 19th century. So previously from last week, I'd been getting into talking about the English Civil War. I had discussed how King Charles I had created this conflict, of course, in the country in England, and divided the country. Remember, you had the Roundheads on one side, and then the royalist Cavaliers on the other. And they came to loggerheads, big bloody war, of course, which totally changed, British history, at that point. Now, I think I talked about how on the parliamentarian side, they formed this army called the New Model Army by 1645. And it's really the army that'll eventually defeat Charles's forces and take over the country. And I had mentioned how they had several men involved. Of course, I'll get to the site of the Battle of Naseby. That's going to be kind of important, pretty much involved. I'll get into that battle in a second right there. But I was talking before about how they had these two different commanders that are part of the New Model Army, which you see there, where, of course, Sir Thomas Fairfax, who they called sometimes Black Tom, was considered the commander of the actual parliamentarian forces. And then actually Oliver Cromwell, who was a member of Parliament and a Puritan, was actually the one that will eventually take over the country. He eventually becomes the commander of the forces by the end of the war and becomes later Lord Protector, if you know about that, over England. He'll totally change the country, creating a dictatorship and all that. But on the other side, you had Charles I with his royalist army, and you had this nephew who was part German, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who led especially his cavalry forces, but they were kind of outnumbered, of course, in the actual war itself. That's the actual site of the Battle of Naseby that you're looking at right there. Naseby was one of three famous battles that they really had during the English Civil War. I'll kind of share the other ones with you real quick, but they had two other battles that were kind of famous before. Battle of Edge Hill, which kind of took place in the Midlands, central part of England, in 1642. And at the beginning of the war, neither side really was good at fighting war, and that battle was kind of indecisive. But the Battle of Marston Moor, which took place in northern England in July of 1644, was really one of the first battles that really turned the war around in favor of the parliamentarian side, and was actually one of the largest battles of the actual war. I think over 40,000 troops fought in that battle combined. And after Marston Moor, it got to the point where Charles I's forces didn't have much control of the northern part of the country. But then Naseby fought, you see, on June 14th, 1645. That was considered really the most pivotal battle of the whole, and really entire war itself. Here's kind of a map showing you the actual battlefield right here. It actually took place, by the way, if you want to know where it took place, Naseby took place kind of north of London, around what is Northamptonshire County. And you can see with the actual armies on both sides, the New Model Army had a much larger army than the Royalist side, like something like 13,000 troops. And then the Royalist army had infantry with mostly cavalry, which were led by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, I just told you about. And what happened in the battle was that Prince Rupert's forces tried to attack their left flank, but Cromwell's forces basically attacked in the center and on the left flank of Charles. And what would end up happening, if you know about that battle, the Battle of Naseby, pretty much Charles's army was wiped out. Most of the forces were actually captured after the battle. In fact, 3/4 of his army was actually lost at the Battle of Naseby. 4,500 captured, maybe about 1,000 killed or wounded. You can see with those statistics right there. And so one thing about Naseby was that the royalist side never really recovered from that battle. And so within a couple years, um, eventually the royalist side are going to end up losing the war. Eventually, it's going to take a while. They'll eventually, Cromwell's side, the parliamentarian side, they will capture Charles I in 1646. But apparently, what happened was he escaped. Is what happened, escaped to the north and all of that. And so that brought on also another conflict later, which they do have a second civil war that actually breaks out. The Second English Civil War, which is in 1648. Charles actually escaped to Scotland. He's obviously mostly related to Scots, and so he went up there to form an alliance with them to try to see if he could get his throne back and all that, get power back. And so he made this alliance with the Scottish Presbyterians. They were called the Scottish Culminators. They were nicknamed. And he promised the Presbyterians in Scotland that he would let them have um, their Presbyterian church, like as it is, and they wouldn't have to adopt like the Episcopacy type, churches that they have in the Anglican Church, where they have like bishops and priests, which they didn't want. That's why they kind of fought the so-called bishop wars before with England and Scotland, and so they fought on his side with him to try to see if they could put him back on the throne, get power back. And it led to a battle called the Battle of Preston, you see there in 1648. But Cromwell's forces pushed into northern England and just routed their forces. And pretty much Charles eventually gets captured again, is what occurred. That'll lead eventually to, if you know about this, the trial and execution of Charles I. If you know about this afterwards, what ends up happening is he's put on trial for treason because they kind of view Charles I as being going against the state. And the only thing is, when they put him on trial for treason, he refused to actually make a plea because of the fact that King Charles views himself as an absolutist. He didn't think they could actually do that to put him on trial. And so when he was found guilty in January January of 1649, January 27th is the date, they eventually would execute him over time. And by the way, they part of why they were able to do this was the fact that what happened was there was this man named Colonel Thomas Pride who was under Cromwell, and what they did was they went into Parliament, the so-called Long Parliament. They purged all of the members of Parliament that were against the new model army and their policies, and so this became known as Pride's Purge. And so all the members of the parliament that were left over, they became known as the so-called Rump Parliament. They were nicknamed. And the Rump Parliament was the one that formed the so-called High Court of Justice that would charge Charles with treason, and then they would eventually have him executed afterwards. I think got an image of that showing that right there. But here's the actual execution, like a painting of Charles I, which, by the way, him being executed was considered a controversial thing when they did do this. He was executed on January 30th, 1649. I don't think there's been too many monarchs that have been executed, like British monarchs. I think the only thing I can think of is, at least in the modern ones, was the Lady Jane Grey, who was never really, I guess, officially coronated as the monarch. She might be one example in modern times that was executed. I think a long time ago, maybe medieval times or something like that. Maybe have been something like that. But his execution, part of who was behind it, if you know about it, there's the death warrant of King Charles I, of course, was Oliver Cromwell. He was one of the men that signed it. I think he's the third man on the bottom left that actually signed the death warrant to have him executed. They had one more battle that they fought too, which kind of get into a little later about the Battle of Dunbar, which you see there. They did have a third English Civil War, believe it or not, 1649 to 1651. Well, if you know about it, Charles the First had a son who was Prince Charles, of course, and he basically invaded Scotland and basically claimed himself the king of Scotland at that point. And so what happened was Cromwell had to basically invade into Scotland to prevent him from trying to claim the throne and all that. And so it led to the Battle of Dunbar, which happened in September of 1650. There's kind of a painting showing Cromwell at the head of the new model army at Dunbar, which is, by the way, considered the last major battle they really fight in that whole civil wars. And I think if the story about this is true, Charles later would escape. There's a famous story in 1651 how he was almost captured by Cromwell, but Charles was able to prevent his capture by hiding in an oak tree, and he was able to get away and all that. So, and but I'm going to talk about the main thing. Of course, we'll get to today is what does Cromwell do to England afterwards? Well, Cromwell eventually, by the end of the Civil War, takes over the country. In fact, England goes through kind of a Republican period. It's like the only time when they were really a republic, the British. It's often called different names, the Commonwealth of England or Commonwealth of Britain. They also call it the Protectorate, I think is another common name. We'll nickname it. And then some people call it the Interregnum because it's kind of between monarchs, between Charles the First and Charles the Second, who of course come in later as well. Cromwell, who you see on the right there, kind of blew him up right there. He of course, originally nicknamed Old Ironsides. He was also sometimes called Puritan Moses because he was very religious, big Puritan. He once made the comment that he thought that he that prays best fights best. And he had been a member of Parliament before the war. And then, of course, during the war, he became the top general on the parliamentarian side of the New Model Army. And he was a great military leader, but the man really was not a great politician. He would end up, of course, being controversial and would turn into a dictator, is what he would eventually become. And so over time, what ends up happening is Cromwell, of course, rules the country as the so-called Lord Protector, they called him. And he's a dictator for about 5 or 6 years that he reigns over the country. And I think there was even talk of making Cromwell like a king, like King Oliver. I think he even had another title called head of state or something like that. And so it was almost equivalent to like a president, maybe if you want to call it. But a lot of people kind of saw it as a military dictator more than anything. Now, he was controversial. If you know about Cromwell, Cromwell was known for doing a lot of changes to England, which I'll kind of talk about a little bit. One of the things you can see here, so yeah, he took over Parliament and became a dictator. And then the Puritans start to become really take control of the country. It's one of the things that really occurs in the country because he's a very religious man. And you can see there the Puritans did all kinds of things. They shut down all of the like inns. They closed down all the theaters. Like I mentioned how the Globe Theater existed at one point that Shakespeare had started. Well, they closed the Globe Theater down. You couldn't have plays and things like that being put on. Most sports were banned. If you caught playing football on Sunday, you could be whipped. You can see there were punishments. Swearing was punished by a fine. Though those who kept swearing could be sent to prison, believe it or not. Sunday became a very special day for the Puritans. You couldn't work or do anything. They even banned Christmas, if you know the story about that. Women couldn't do certain things on holy days. They couldn't wear certain kind of clothes. They couldn't wear certain kinds of makeup, things like that. And so the Puritans were very strict with their religious beliefs. This happened like in America, like in American colonialism with the British American colonies. Then on top of that, what happened as well, Cromwell then went into Ireland. He invaded Ireland with this new model army. This took place, by the way, between 1649 to 52. And he sacked several cities there, including you see there Drogheda and another city called Wexford. You see in that list were both sacked by Cromwell's forces. And they think they may have killed like something like, I forget the number of people that died, I know, when they went over there, but 40% maybe of the Irish population was wiped out from Cromwell's policies. I think I get numbers like 600 to 700,000 may have died because of his policies and all that. And so he tried to take over all of Ireland and all that and make it more Protestant. And Cromwell was hated by the Irish and still hated today. Like if you go to Ireland, Republic of Ireland, they still don't like Oliver Cromwell. He did have a son later. Of course, what happened was after Cromwell died, his son took over, Richard Cromwell, who was also Lord Protector for about maybe 9 months, is what it was. But he didn't really have the backing of the military like his father did. He wasn't really a military mind and all that. And so what eventually happened to Richard Cromwell, he was eventually overthrown in a coup by the new model army. The military overthrew him, and later on, the royalists, people that came in later that took over, like Charles II, of course, restore the Stuarts and all that. They would later kind of give Richard Cromwell a nickname, Tumble Down Dick or Queen Dick, because he was seen as a weak, ineffectual ruler. And so I think he went into exile, but later came back, Richard Cromwell. But that's going to lead into a new period, of course, in British history when they get rid of the Cromwells and they put the Stuarts back in. You get the Restoration in 1660. And what happened was in 1660, between April to about December, the so-called Convention Parliament met in London, and they proclaimed that Charles II, the son of Charles I, would be restored to the British throne. And so the Stuarts were put back in, is what occurred. So that happened on actually May 29th. You can see 1660. It actually was referred to as sometimes Restoration Day, which I think happened to be his birthday, by the way. They do sometimes call it Oak Apple Day or Royal Oak Day also as well, because of the fact that he had hid in an oak tree and not get captured by Cromwell, because I guess Cromwell would have probably executed him too, on top of that. And there's images, of course, of the Restoration where Charles is, of course, put back on the throne at that point. Let's talk about Charles II a little bit. He does have a nickname that they call him. He's often called, by the way, the Merry Monarch. It's kind of a nickname he was called because of two reasons. One, it was a happier period, like this post-Reformation period we're kind of getting into is a more happier period. It's more looser too, more liberal for sure. They kind of get rid of the Puritanism, and a lot of the Puritans flee the country at that point. But if you know about Charles II, he was also known for having a lot of mistresses. He had like something like 11 illegitimate children that he had. You can kind of see his wife there, kind of blow her up. But his wife was this woman from Portugal named Catherine of Braganza. And apparently they didn't have any legitimate children that survived. And so he had 11 illegitimate children with a bunch of mistresses. And so the joke about Charles II was that he was the father of England because he had so many of these kids running around and all that. And so Charles II is one of several of these Stuarts that'll, of course, come in later that'll take over the country. And he was kind of somewhat popular of a monarch. By the way, these are the other Stuart monarchs that reigned later. I'll kind of mention. But besides Charles II, you've got James II, who's the brother of Charles II. He's actually controversial because he's Catholic. We'll get to that later. William and Mary also reigned later, who were related to James II. You can see who were actually first cousins that married each other. And then you had Queen Anne, was the last of the Stuart monarchs that also came in later. So those are the remaining ones that'll come in later that I'll kind of talk about. Let me talk about some famous events that happened under Charles II that are kind of well known. And some of these you may have heard of before that occurred. One of the most famous that happened was in the 1660s, which was the so-called Great Plague of London that broke out over about a year and a half. And the Great Plague of London was a massive outbreak of bubonic plague that wiped out a large population of London and England. By the 17th, 18th century, they started calling it the Black Death, if you know about this. And the bubonic plague was a type of plague that was spread by rats, especially rat fleas. I think if you want to know the actual name of the plague bacterium, it's called Yersinia pestis. And the plague itself was really the worst. If you study about the Black Death that happened in the 14th century, but it was considered like one of the later plagues that was the worst since probably the Black Death that they had. And the plague was famous for its symptoms, like the so-called bobos that would form on the body, which you can see there. And it was actually named for this, the actual plague bacterium that caused it was named for this doctor that discovered it in China in the 1890s, named Dr. Alexander Yersin. And so they really don't start calling it Black Death until later. But the actual Black Death would cause a lot of people to die. I think they actually think that about. I think the numbers that I've got is somewhere a little bit over 100,000 may have actually died within like maybe a year and a half between 1665 to 1666, which was actually close to one-fourth of the London population back then, which now, of course, London's much larger population. And they were later, I think, when they later found like a lot of bodies buried, like in mass graves, and some were even burned also because they ran out of places to put graves also as well. Of course, if you ever study about the Black Death that hit London in the 17th century, there's a famous English nursery rhyme that's associated with it, which is Ring Around the Rosie. And that's the origin of supposedly where that nursery rhyme came from. It was from the Great Plague of London overall. Sometimes I mention about this too, also as well. But the British were the first to create quarantines. That was one thing that kind of came out of the whole Great Plague of London, where if you got the plague, they would basically lock you up in your house for 40 days. And you couldn't come out until afterwards. And you either, I guess, survived or you died. And I think they would put a cross on the door or something like that if you had the plague. And that's kind of, compared to like COVID. I know when COVID was at its peak, they were like 2 weeks, I think was the quarantine. But originally quarantine was for 40 days. That's how many days it was. The other thing that was real famous too that happened under Charles was the Great Fire of London. That's probably the more famous thing that happened really in the 17th century, which wiped out a good majority of the old medieval London that had been built going back to like Roman times. And the Great Fire of London occurred in September of 1666 over like a period of like basically 4 days. And you can see it destroyed a great deal of the old city, like over 13,000 buildings. I forget how many churches were destroyed, but it destroyed a lot of churches also as well, including the famous, I think it's St. Peter's Cathedral that's there, I think was burned down as well. I think I've got images showing you the Great Fire of London right here, but I've got a map that shows you kind of, actually, that's not St. Peter, St. Paul's Cathedral was what burned down, excuse me. And they think it's like, if you study about like London itself, it's one of the worst two disasters that ever hit London. That in the Blitz, if you know, when Nazi Germany air bombed London and other cities during the war, especially between 1940-41, which is the worst, which killed a lot more people than they think the Great Fire of London did. But fire itself, you can see, started near where the London Bridge is. You can see right there in that map near the Thames River. And they think it was actually an accident. There was apparently a bakery that was owned by this man named Thomas Fariner. who made a lot of bread and other things for the Royal Navy. And apparently, on Pudding Lane was where it was, and a fire started in this bakery. It spread to the rest of the city, and it burned out most of the old area of the medieval part of the city. But it didn't really get to where the royal family was, like Whitehall and all that. And apparently, there was a man that came forward named Robert Hubert that claimed that he actually started the fire, but I think they later executed him for it. But it proved later that it was an accident. And so that totally changed London afterwards. When they rebuilt the city, they had to reconstruct how they would build like the streets and the buildings. And so that would later lead to, the more modern London that we have later. So that's St. Paul's Cathedral. Yeah, that's the one that burned down actually. Uh, that's where they held the funeral, if you remember correctly. Well, actually, that's where they had the body, I think, is where it was. I thought St. Paul's, one of those funerals that they had there. That was for Queen Elizabeth II. So anyway, I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about a few other things. Also, I did want to mention something else that happened too under Charles II. There were apparently these couple plots to try and kill him off and his brother, James II. One of them was called the Popish plot that happened between 1678 to 1681. And apparently, this man named Titus Oates, who was, they think, a Catholic priest, was going around England saying that there was a Jesuit conspiracy to kill Charles and his brother James, like to wipe out the royal family. And it created this mass hysteria throughout the country where they thought Catholics were going to kill, Charles II and all that. And it was called the Popish plot, but it proved to be actually not true. It was just made up. He was called, Titus Oates the liar, and he was later, I think, imprisoned for it and all that. But there was a lot of hysteria in the country that they thought Catholics were everywhere. So a lot of people didn't like Catholics and all that stuff. And so what happened was a bunch of attempts to try to ban a lot of people like Catholics and all that kind of occurred afterwards. They had this thing called the Exclusion Bill they started trying to pass in Parliament, which would prevent James II, the Duke of York, the brother of Charles II, from getting the throne because he was Catholic. But Charles II wouldn't sign off on it, and so it never came to fruition. But they were able to pass this through Parliament, which was the Test Acts. The Test Acts are kind of blow up here. The Test Acts came out. And what that did, it was passed by part. There were actually two of them. It was one in 1673 and one in 1678. And what it did was it said that basically, if you were Catholic, you couldn't serve in the British military, you couldn't be in the government, and you had to actually take an oath that you were like an Anglican or Protestant, at least. And so that was kind of a way to prevent, they were worried about Catholics taking over everywhere, especially in England. And so that was the reason for why that happened. They had one more plot I will mention about, which is true about this. They had this one that was called the Rye House plot. Was one more that occurred. That was another anti-Catholic plot, they think, as well, where they tried to murder Charles II and James II. It was some kind of attempt to try to remove them from power, because they were kind of worried that James II was going to come in and become a Catholic ruler. And so it involved members of parliament. It was a huge cabal, which they're not sure how many people were involved in it. 30, 40, 50 people may have been involved in it at one point. And apparently it was called the Rye House plot because Charles and his brother James were going to go to some horse races that were in Newmarket to the north of kind of northeast of England. And apparently, halfway there, they find out that there's a fire in the town and it's going to burn down or something like that. I think half the town burned down or something like that. And so they decided to come back and didn't go to the races. And halfway there was some kind of rye house where the plotters were going to meet at and try to intercept them and kill them, but they never showed up. And so the plot didn't come to fruition. But apparently, a bunch of people got put on trial for this, and I think at least 12 people were executed and a bunch of people were exiled, including John Locke, believe it or not, there's a theory that John Locke was somehow involved in it. There's never been really proved about it, but he actually went into exile for a while in the Dutch Republic because of that. Now, what happened was after Charles died, his brother came in, James II, which we're talking about, the Duke of York. Of course, I told you he's the last Catholic ruler of Britain. And of course, his reign would end up causing what they call the Glorious Revolution to occur, which totally changed the country afterwards. So, yeah, he was a controversial figure, the Duke of York. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that James, there was two things about him that they didn't like about him. One, the fact that he was kind of real supportive towards the Catholics, pro-French, of course, because the Bourbons were cousins of theirs. And then he was also pro-divine right as well. He thought he should be an absolutist, like previous rulers like Charles I. And so that didn't really help him, in itself right there. And the other controversy had to do with his wives. I kind of blow these up right here, but Anne Hyde on the left was his first wife, of course, which he had married back in 1660, who he had two children with, by the way, which were daughters, Queen Mary, later Mary II, who was later married to William and Mary, those two. And then he had a younger daughter named Queen Anne, both who were Protestant, by the way. So I guess they weren't really worried about that issue. But the other problem that happened, of course, that really caused all the problems to come about. His first wife died in 1671, and he married this woman here named Mary Medina, who I believe was from Italy, and she was Catholic. They called her Mary Beatrice. And anyway, apparently he had converted to Catholicism a few years before. I'm not sure if it's either 1668 or 1667 it was, but I know it was public by the time that, Charles was almost getting close to the end later on. But you got pretty much that occurring in what really caused all the problems, which was in 1688, the summer of 1688, to be exact, was that they had a son whose name was James Francis Edward Stuart, later known as the James III or the Old Pretender. So the Stuarts called him. He was born in June of 1688. And so that's really when Protestants in the country start really worrying at that point about what's going to happen to England. Are we going to have another Catholic ruler and a Catholic ruler and a Catholic ruler? That's an issue that really caused, in the end, the so-called Glorious Revolution to occur. Now, they had an option they could do where they could put someone else in, which is what Parliament starts thinking about this point. And so what happens, Parliament decides in 1688 to invite William of Orange, who happened to be James II's nephew, who was the ruler of the Dutch Republic in the Netherlands. And he was married to Mary. Mary was his first cousin, who happened to be the daughter of James II. So they're both Stuarts, both of them related Stuarts. And so what they decided to do was invite both of those over to come over and basically take over the country as joint rulers, William and Mary. And so what Parliament did, Parliament decided to write a letter to William of Orange to invite him to come over and take the throne. It was called different names. It was sometimes called the Immortal Seven Letter because 7 members of Parliament were the ones that wrote it up. It was also known as the Invitation to William letter also as well, saying that they would codle together, William and Mary. So that's what happened with that. And so what occurred was in 1688, William of Orange came over with his army. About November is what it was. Yeah, they crossed the English Channel. One of the last, by the way, do that successfully, cross the English Channel, take over the country. And it becomes this bloodless coup where James II is forced to give up his throne because the British army won't support it. They won't give him any backing. And so very little bloodshed is actually shed on both sides between James's side and William's side. And so pretty much by 1689, William and Mary are going to, of course, take over the country at that point, which I'll get to in a second, of course, and talk about. Uh, now, what's going to transform from that, of course, is that Parliament's going to come in by 1689, and they're going to create this thing called the Bill of Rights, which you see here after the Glorious, which I guess the Glorious Revolution kind of goes on until 1689, really. And Here's kind of an image of the Bill of Rights right here. But the Bill of Rights, what the Bill of Rights is going to do, it's going to create what is a limited monarchy in the country. It's going to create this parliamentarian constitutional monarchy where William and Mary become like they're heads of state, but they over time they're going to become more like figureheads, and the power is going to be more rested in Parliament. Like Parliament has all the power to really pass all the laws and the legislation, and also monetary things like taxation and things like that. And the Bill of Rights also said it also kind of outlined civil rights for all Englishmen, like what all the rights of Englishmen will be, in the country, and it'll also ban also Catholic rulers also as well. Will be the other thing it'll also be with it as well. Here's kind of a list of things that were kind of drafted in it, right? They were kind of blow up, but the king could not suspend the operation of laws. The laws, were pretty much done by Parliament. The king could not interfere with the ordinary course of justice. No tax or levied or standard army maintained in peacetime without Parliament's consent. Freedom of speech in Parliament. Sessions of Parliament would be held frequently. Subjects had the right of bail, petition, freedom from excessive fines, cruel and unusual punishment. 7, the monarch must be Protestant. Notice that. 8, freedom from arbitrary arrest. 9, censorship of the press was dropped. 10, religious toleration is something else that they include also as well. Because I think right after they have this thing called the Toleration Act, you see there that Parliament also passed in 1689, which gave religious rights to people that were non-Anglican. I think including Catholics later, they start giving them rights also as well. So yeah, no imprisonment without charge. That was another thing that apparently they were doing before. So they couldn't suspend your habeas corpus rights, was something that's kind of important there also as well. So that's going to lead to, we're going to get, of course, the Bill of Rights, which the Bill of Rights, by the way, is very influential. This man you see there, John Locke, who was famous for his essays called Two Treatises on Government, which I think he had published right before that, was a major influence on the actual Bill of Rights document that came out, which is a big part of, Britain's constitutional system that they have, which is not really based on a single constitution, but on many documents that they have overall. So that's going to lead to the joint, rule of William and Mary. So those two are kind of ruled together as equals. It's not happened very often, by the way, in British history. Right there, you can see that William III would reign until 1702, and then Mary would die before him in 1694. So at least for about looks like 5 years, they kind of co-ruled together before she died. All that. Now, I did want to talk about this other thing that happened right after, of course, the Glorious Revolution that kind of broke up, kind of took off at that point overall. And they had this thing called the Jacobite movement, or some people call it Jacobitism also as well, which they do think was started by the Glorious Revolution. And apparently the House of Stuart side that was, pro-Catholic or whatever, people that supported the Catholic side and all that, they got cut out of the line of succession. And so there was a movement between the 17th and 18th centuries to put them back in power. And the word Jacobite, by the way, comes from the Hebrew name of the Latinized name of James, which I think is Jacobus, is the name for James in Latin. And so it spawned all these Jacobite rebellions, which broke out in Scotland. They broke out in Ireland. I guess anywhere there were kind of people that were kind of pro-Catholic also as well. And a lot of them were called risings when they would rebel against the British government of the Protestant Stuarts, or really, the Protestant Stuarts were later the House of Hanover had the same problem also as well. And they had the Williamite War, 1689 to 91. And they had three other risings, the Jacobite risings in 15, 19, and also the one in 45 also as well. They tried to put different monarchs back in. I know initially they tried to put James II back on the throne, the Jacobites, who you see here. And it's also called the War of the English Succession, was I think was another nickname they called it, which was part of the whole nine years war that was kind of going on in Europe and worldwide at the time. And James actually tried to invade Ireland in 1690 and was defeated by William's forces, the Williamite forces, at the Battle of Boyne, July 1st, 1690. And the Irish call it the War of the Two Kings because you had James II and William III trying to see who should control Britain and all that at the time. And he was defeated and forced to go into exile at that point. And the Irish were so mad about James and thought he was such a bad leader and I guess general and all that of his forces. They called him James the Shite, or I guess the shit, if you want. They had also his son and his grandson on the left and right. James III, they sometimes called him the Old Pretender, was kind of famous. He was involved in the Rising of 15, where he tried to take power back. This was after King George I and the Hanover dynasty took over Britain, which was a German dynasty I'll kind of get to later. But that actually failed also as well. And then his son, the Old Pretender's son, on the right, which they sometimes called, they called him originally Charles Edward Stuart. He was sometimes dubbed Charles III, by the way, by some of the Stuarts. And he was called the Young Pretender. And he was involved in the Rising of 45, which I think they say that one may have been the one that was the most famous one of the different Jacobite risings. And they called him later Bonnie Prince Charlie, was his name. And they fought pretty much the Jacobite rebellions until 1746, when the last Jacobites were defeated at the Battle of Culloden in April of 1746. And they consider that to be one of the last major battles ever fought on British soil. And so the Jacobites, they never were able to get back, the Catholic side of that throne or whatever they wanted. I think they still got Jacobites that's still around that kind of still want the throne back, but they're probably never going to get it back. Now, after William and Mary both died, you had also one more Stuart I did want to talk about that came to power. And that, of course, was Queen Anne, who reigned from 1702 to 1714. She was a younger sister of Mary II, who died, by the way. They didn't have any children, William and Mary. And so the throne went to her. And kind of a sad story about her. She had a bunch of children. In fact, if you blow this up here, she had 17 times she was pregnant, believe it or not. And all the children died. Like all of her kids died at one point. Some died, I think some lived maybe young age. All of them died tragically. And so because of the fact that she didn't have any direct heirs to the throne, what that meant was that Parliament had to figure out what they were going to do with the actual British throne, like who was going to take over afterwards. And so 1701, they passed this act called the Act of Settlement. And what it did was it gave the actual British throne to a German dynasty known as Hanover, the House of Hanover, which was part of a state, little princedom. I think it was elector of Hanover. Yeah, the electorate of Hanover in northern Germany. And this man named George of Hanover would come over and take over. And part of why the Hanover dynasty got the throne was because they were Protestant. is what it was. And so that's the reason why that occurred. And so all these Catholic rulers that were, Jacobites or whatever, they all got passed up because of it. The other thing that happened too under her, both the English and the Scottish parliaments passed these things called the Acts of Parliament in 1707 to 1708. And that officially created the United Kingdom of Great Britain, which it wasn't really official, going back to King James I and all that. And so that's what led to eventually the Union Jack flag being created, which you see here, where they took all the combined flags of England, Scotland, and later Ireland and combined it together to create this flag that represented this, Union or United Kingdom. And so that's where they get this flag from over time. Originally in the 18th century, you can see on the left, that's the actual flag that they originally used in the 1700s, where they took the St. George's Cross of England and the St. Andrew's Cross of Scotland. They merged it together. Then by the 19th century, in the 1800s, they then took the actual, flag that Union Jack at that time, and they added the St. Patrick's Cross of Ireland. That flag they merged together. That now represents, I guess, Northern Ireland today instead. So that's how that came about. And then over time, they start using that flag everywhere as the British Empire spread throughout the world. They start using other flags in other colonies and countries around the world. And it's still used. I know Australia, New Zealand, I think are two of the main countries that probably use the most, where it's still used. Now I'm going to get next and talk about some of the later dynasties they have later. I'll kind of talk about the one of Hanover, and I'll talk about Windsor also as well for a few minutes. We'll talk more about the British Empire later when I get to the 19th century. I'll kind of give you some basic information about some of the rulers that come later. What happened after the end of the Stuarts? You have the House of Hanover came in, where George of Hanover becomes the actual monarch, which was kind of controversial, by the way, because apparently when he became the king, there were a bunch of riots that broke out in the country, Georgian riots, who people didn't really want this German guy taking over the country, but they didn't want a Catholic ruler. That was their other choice. They could probably do. And so it began a new period in British history where I'll kind of show you a list of monarchs that are right here. But these are all the rulers of the Hanover dynasty that ruled over Britain. A lot of the ones, especially the first like 5 that you're looking at right there, it's often referred to as the Georgian era because they're all related back to King George I. And the first 2, actually, George I and George II, didn't speak any English. They were pretty much German or spoke German and all that. That is a very interesting period in pretty much in British history that you have occur. You do see a lot of things that occur because of the House of Hanover dynasty overall. One thing that happens is you get the rise of these political parties in Britain, going back to the Glorious Revolution and up to the Georgian era. You get these 2 political parties that kind of form, which are the Whig Party, the Tory parties, the Tories. They kind of start forming. Whigs are more liberal, Tories are more conservative overall. And so that's the beginning of a lot of different politics and why Britain has different political parties today. I think the Tories today is kind of like the Conservative Party. I think the Whigs used to be the Liberal Party, but that party went defunct. And now it's the Labour Party, I think, is the majority party that they have besides the Tories, really the Conservatives that are really have majority now. Because Liz Truss is a conservative, of course, all that. I'll get to it later, but under the Georgian era also as well, you get the beginning of really Britain becoming an industrial power. You start seeing that where Britain's one of the first countries to industrialize throughout the world. They change their agriculture. They become more of a modernized agriculture, which leads into like industrialization, urbanization, where a lot of their cities expand. French and American revolutions also occur under that period. which are kind of turbulent with the French. I know that, but the American Revolution, they lost the British 13 colonies. Was one of the things that came out of that. They fought and defeated Napoleon. Then after Napoleon, that's when the British Empire really takes off. And it was a period of the Age of Enlightenment, the Romantic movements that also happened too, as well. One thing about George the First I did want to mention about him, by the way, he was the one that founded the British cabinet system, where they, the different cabinets they have and government posts and all of that. But he's the main thing he did that's real famous, if you know about him, was that he appointed the first prime minister of Great Britain, which was Sir Robert Walpole, who you see right here. And so over time, the prime minister is going to be the one that really heads up the British government, whereas the monarch is just like the head of state. So like they have these two heads of state. They kind of have one running the government and one running this actual state. They do have other monarchs later after George II. They do have George III, who was a grandson of George II that they have. And he's famous for a lot of things. He's considered the longest reigning male heir that the British ever had, which he reigned, you can see, for close to about 60 years that he was in power. It's really under him that the British Empire starts really expanding. I know they lost the American 13 colonies and all that, but after him, they start expanding elsewhere, not just in Canada, but other parts of the world as well. And so he's kind of a famous ruler overall. But he was around so darn long. If you study about George III, that he was around up to the time of Napoleon. So when he was the monarch, they were defeating Napoleon. Just to kind of give you an idea. I think he comes into power when the 7 Years' War is going on, and he dies when Napoleon's pretty much going into exile. So pretty amazing about that. He was known for going mad, though. They tell stories about George III being sometimes nicknamed Mad King or Mad King George. They dubbed him because he suffered from some kind of mental illness, which may have been a combination of bipolarism or maybe even dementia as well. He also suffered from a blood disorder, porphyria, I think it was called, or actually porphyria, they say it actually. And it caused him to go mad during his reign. And I think near the end of his reign, he didn't really know where he was or who he was as king. They do have, of course, the later ruler, who's like one of the last ones that they have, which is Queen Victoria. She, of course, they had William IV, who reigned next. And then there was Queen Victoria, who was a niece of William IV. And she was the last Hanover monarch that would be in power. She would reign from 1837 to 1901. And her reign was considered to be one of the greatest in British history, because the fact that she reigned so long, at least up to that point, she had reigned the longest in history, 63 to 64 years that she was in power. It's really under her reign that Britain starts to become a major empire in the world. They start talking about the imperial century, about the fact that the British have so much control of the world that they control everything that's basically where the sun never sets on the British Empire, as they used to say. And Britain went more away from like the Americas. They decided more that the best natural resources, best source of labor are really in Africa, Asia, in the Pacific. And so they started expanding more toward the east rather than in the Western Hemisphere. You can see that because of her influence overall with the British Empire, they do often call that period when she's in power the so-called Victorian era. And they do sometimes nickname it, the Victorian era is sometimes called the Pax Britannica. That's one of the nicknames for it, because the fact that they, in a sense, because of their power, their navy, and so on, they're able to keep world peace for almost a century. just about after the Napoleonic Wars. I do have other images showing her husband. That's her husband, Prince Albert, who was from this state called Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which was actually, I think, two kingdoms or two states that was in northern Germany. He was actually her cousin, I think, first cousin that he married, and so because of that, the children of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert started a new dynasty that they later call the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which is later called Windsor. And I think I've got an image showing the two together, Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. I think this image here is actually considered one of the first pictures of a royal couple of the British that was actually taken. When I guess when photography took off in the 19th century. Queen Victoria, by the way, had a nickname. She was called the Grandmother of Europe because a lot of her children, grandchildren, either married into various royal families, dynasties throughout Europe, or they were ruling over various countries. Like later on, I think the Kaiser Wilhelm II, you know about it, and also the Tsar Nicholas II. We're all basically like related to her. I think grandsons or something of her, basically. They do have, of course, you can see here's kind of like a tree, well, like a tree showing the family tree of House of Windsor that you've got. So from Queen Victoria, you've got Edward VII, followed by George V, and then George V had two sons, Edward VIII, George VI. Then you got Elizabeth II, and then of course now I'll get to it later. We do have Charles III also as well. There is Edward. Edward VII, of course, was the oldest son, of course, of Queen Victoria. He reigned over what they call the Edwardian era, which some people kind of saw it as an extension of the Victorian era overall. And he was kind of an important figure, Edward, by the way. Edward not only, continued the dynasty you can see there, which would later be called Windsor and all that, but he's kind of an important figure because he was later nicknamed the Peacemaker because of the fact that one of the things that Britain started doing was they started making peace with countries like France and Russia that they had maybe fought before, like especially France, overall going back to Napoleon. And that's going to be very instrumental when World War One breaks out in 1914. So you can see it right there in that image. He was very fashionable, which I think Edward kind of influenced a lot of fashions and all that in 20th century, 20th century Britain at the time and all that. And then, of course, kind of talk about, of course, some of his children that he had. He had, of course, you can see there, you've got King George V, of course, the oldest son of Edward, that'll come in. And he's really considered the one that changes the name. If you know about that, what occurred to really do that was the fact that World War One broke out in 1914, and so they didn't really want to have a German name, for the royal family, House of Saxburg, Coburg, that name we talked, Saxe-Coburg Gotha. They didn't want that German name. And so they decided to change the name to the House of Windsor in 1917. And so it was named for actually, like it says there, Windsor Castle is basically where the name came from. So he'll reign from 1910 to 1936. There's Windsor Castle, of course, the origin thing. So a lot of dynasties in Europe were named after castles and all that. They do think under his reign, that's when the British Empire peaked. I think 1922. I think some people think is the peak year of when the British Empire peaked at one point. But under him, by the 1920s, pretty much they controlled like 1/4 of the world's like land mass and population to kind of give you an idea. He did have two sons that reigned later. Edward VIII, you see on the left, reigned briefly for less than a year in 1936. And then he had a brother named George VI that reigned afterwards. What's the deal with the one on the left? Well, Edward VIII, he abdicated the throne because he wanted to marry this American divorcee named Wallace Simpson, who apparently hadn't really finalized her divorce, and the Parliament in the Anglican Church wasn't too happy about this, about marrying this woman. And so he decided to basically pick love over the throne. And so he abdicated the throne. And so Parliament had to redraw the whole line of succession. And they gave it to his brother, George VI, who you see on the right. And George VI, he'll reign from 1936 to 1952. And he's kind of an interesting figure. I don't know if you heard much about him before, but he was the one that had that stammering problem that he had, where he would give his speeches. I know when he went to give his first speech as king, he stuttered a lot and it was kind of embarrassing, and so he had to work on that issue to give speeches. And I know when he uh, read the Declaration of War against Germany in 1939, he was great with that. And so people looked up to him as a great ruler, and they made movies about it later. I know Colin Farrell I think, got an Academy Award for the King's Speech in 2010, which represented that ideas behind that. But he is known for famous prime ministers like Winston Churchill later. He's, of course, very well known today. There, of course, was the next ruler that came in afterwards. After George VI died in 1952. Elizabeth II then reigned. Of course, we've talked about her before. Of course, the longest reigning monarch in British history, reigning a little bit over 70 years. She was in power from 1952 to recently, just died a few weeks ago, September of 2022. And so under her reign, I think she's seen something like, I forget how many, I think 15 prime ministers have been in power under her. She's been in power so darn long overall. Winston Churchill, I think, was one of her first prime ministers when she actually came in as the monarch. I think her most famous prime minister after that was probably Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, you may have heard of also as well. So she, of course, had just celebrated her platinum jubilee, like I think a couple months before that, before she died. But now, of course, the current ruler now, you see, of course, we have now King Charles III. He, of course, took over as the new British monarch in 2022. Of course, remember, he was previously the Prince of Wales, the one of the longest reigning heir apparents, probably in not just British history, but in world history overall. And now his son, as you know, is the new, of course, Prince of Wales, also the new heir apparent to the British throne, of course, if Charles were to die or abdicate the throne overall. So kind of a history of what the Windsors kind of look like, of course, right now. But pretty much the British Empire, we'll talk about the rise of it, like how it kind of rises and falls. That'll kind of happen between the 19th and the 20th century. I'm kind of just talking about the beginnings of it with these lectures, of course, about British history pretty much overall. So that's pretty much it for the history of Britain for now. I'll kind of, like I said, come back later. Of course, I think probably later in the semester we'll kind of get to the 19th century and talk about other things that happened later, especially with imperialism, which they're kind of notorious for.